The wagon stopped at the edge of nowhere, and 16-year-old Eliza Crane was pushed off with nothing but the dress on her back and the accusations still ringing in her ears. Thief, they had called her. Ungrateful wretch. The October wind cut through her thin cotton dress as she watched the wagon disappear back toward Millbrook, Pennsylvania, carrying the aunt who had never wanted her and the uncle who had looked away when his wife demanded she be gone. The year was 1934, and the Great Depression had turned neighbor against neighbor, had made even blood ties thin as paper. Eliza stood alone on that dirt road, surrounded by the dying colors of autumn, maples burning red, oaks fading to brown, and understood with terrible clarity that no one was coming back for her. No one would search. No one would wonder if she had survived the night. She had been 7 when consumption took her mother. She still remembered the sound of her mother's coughing in the night, the way it grew weaker, until one morning there was only silence. She remembered holding her mother's hand in those final hours, feeling bones beneath paper-thin skin, watching the light fade from eyes that had always looked at her with such love. She was 8 when her father followed, coughing himself into the grave in a mining camp 300 miles away. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a postman who had no idea he was carrying the end of her childhood. Her father had died alone, surrounded by strangers, calling out for a wife already gone and a daughter he would never see again. For 8 years after that, she had lived in her aunt's house, not as family, but as unpaid labor, as the girl who scrubbed floors and hauled water and was fed last at the table, if there was anything left at all. Her aunt, Margaret, was her mother's sister, but whatever love might have existed between the siblings had not extended to the next generation. Margaret saw in Eliza only a burden, a mouth to feed, a reminder of a sister she had secretly resented. "Your mother always thought she was better than everyone else," Aunt Margaret would say, usually while Eliza was on her knees scrubbing the kitchen floor, reading books, putting on airs. Look where it got her. But Eliza had committed the unforgivable sin of being exactly like her mother. While other children accepted their lot, Eliza questioned. While other girls learned to keep their heads down, Eliza read. Every book, every newspaper, every agricultural pamphlet she could find in the garbage heaps behind the general store. She would wake before dawn to finish her chores early, stealing an hour of reading time before anyone else rose. She would hide books beneath her mattress, in the hollow of a dead tree, in a secret space beneath the chicken coop floorboards. She had read about root cellars in Ireland, about how families had survived famines by storing potatoes in underground chambers where temperature stayed constant year-round. She had read about Russian peasants surviving impossible winters using underground homes called zemlyankas that stayed warm when the air above froze solid. She had read about the science of preservation, about bacteria and moisture and temperature, about the earth itself being a kind of living refrigerator. Her aunt had called this reading dangerous nonsense. Her uncle had warned her that ideas above her station would be her downfall. The other children in Millbrook whispered that Eliza Crane was strange, that she talked to plants, that she spent hours studying the soil instead of doing proper work. That one's touched, she had overheard Mrs. Patterson say at the general store. Reads all the time, asks questions no girl should ask. Mark my words, she'll come to a bad end. It was Mrs. Harrington who had finally destroyed her. Eleanor Harrington was the wealthiest woman in Millbrook, wife of the bank president who had foreclosed on half the farms in the county. She lived in a 3-story house with indoor plumbing and electric lights, and she wore silk dresses imported from Philadelphia, while her neighbors mended the same clothes they had worn for years. She collected silver, teapots and candlesticks and jewelry, and she collected grievances the same way, cataloging every slight, every instance of insufficient deference. She had come to hire Eliza for a day's work cleaning her parlor. It was a common arrangement. Aunt Margaret would rent out Eliza's labor for a few cents, keeping the money herself. Eliza had scrubbed Mrs. Harrington's floors, polished her furniture, cleaned the ash from her fireplace, all while Mrs. Harrington sat in her velvet chair and criticized every movement. "You missed a spot there. No there. Can't you see? Are you blind as well as poor?" When the day was done and Eliza had walked home with aching knees and raw hands, she thought the ordeal was over. She was wrong. The next morning, Mrs. Harrington arrived at Aunt Margaret's door, her face twisted with righteous fury. Her silver brooch was missing, an heirloom, she claimed, worth more than Eliza would earn in a lifetime, and she knew exactly who had taken it. "I saw her eyeing it," Mrs. Harrington declared, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Common thief, just like her father was a common miner. Bad blood will tell." Eliza had not taken the brooch. She had not even noticed it, but her protests were meaningless against the word of the richest woman in town. Aunt Margaret's face settled into an expression of grim satisfaction, as if this accusation was not a catastrophe but an opportunity. "I always knew she would bring shame on this house," Aunt Margaret said. "I've done my Christian duty by her for 8 years, and this is how she repays me." The brooch was later found behind Mrs. Harrington's own settee, where it had fallen when she removed it carelessly. But that was months later, and by then, it was far too late. The accusation had given Aunt Margaret the excuse she had been waiting for. Within hours, Eliza was on that wagon, being driven to the edge of the county with instructions never to return. If you want to find out how this abandoned girl went from having nothing to saving an entire town from starvation, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Because what Eliza Crane built in the mountains of Pennsylvania would become legendary. A system so ingenious that agricultural experts still study it 90 years later. As the dust of the wagon settled, Eliza did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury for people who had someone to comfort them. Instead, she looked at the forest around her and the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow, and she began to walk. She walked north, away from Millbrook, away from everyone who had ever looked through her as if she didn't exist. She walked until her feet bled through her thin shoes, then wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and walked some more. She ate berries when she found them, carefully, always checking against descriptions she had read, knowing the wrong berry could kill her as surely as the cold. She drank from streams, filtering water through layers of her petticoat. She slept in hollow logs and under rock overhangs while frost began to paint the morning grass white. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the darkness, with owls calling and branches creaking and the occasional howl of a distant wolf, she had nothing to do but think. She thought about her mother, who had taught her to love books. She thought about her father, who had called her his little philosopher, and promised that someday he would save enough money to send her to school. She thought about all the dreams that had died with them. But she also thought about the future. Not with hope exactly. Hope seemed like too much to ask for, but with stubborn determination. She would survive this. She would find shelter. She would build something, because the alternative was to lie down and die, and Eliza Crane was not built for giving up. On the fourth day, when she was so weak from hunger that she could barely stand, when her lips were cracked and her hands were numb and her mind was beginning to wander, she stumbled upon something that would change everything. The old Brennan farm had been abandoned for 12 years, ever since the family had packed up after losing their eldest son to influenza and their hope to the economic collapse. The farmhouse had fallen into ruin, its roof caved in under the weight of accumulated winters, its windows shattered, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Eliza approached carefully, half expecting to find someone else had claimed it. But the house was empty, except for rats and rot. She searched through debris, finding nothing useful except a rusted knife and a ceramic pot. It was when she walked behind the house, following a path barely visible under years of overgrowth, that she found something extraordinary. The Brennans had started building an underground storage facility, a massive root cellar complex carved into the hillside. They had lined it with carefully fitted stone and created 3 separate chambers connected by low tunnels. The largest chamber was perhaps 20 feet by 15, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright. The walls were solid, the floor was dry, and even in October's chill, the temperature inside was noticeably warmer than the air above. Natural springs seeping through the rock kept the humidity perfect for storing vegetables. The Brennans had positioned their cellar to take advantage of the Earth's natural insulation, the consistent temperature below the frost line, the thermal mass of surrounding stone. The structures were incomplete. They had clearly planned to expand before tragedy interrupted, but they were sound. And Eliza, standing in the largest chamber with her hand pressed against the cool stone wall, understood immediately what she had found. She had found a place to survive. More than that, she had found a place where she could build something lasting. That first winter nearly killed her anyway. She had no supplies, no tools beyond the rusted knife, no experience with true survival outside the pages of books. She made her home in the largest underground chamber, piling leaves and dried grass for insulation, blocking the entrance with branches woven tight against the wind. She built a small fire pit near the entrance where smoke could escape, learning through painful trial and error exactly how much fire she could sustain without filling the chamber with choking fumes. She ate whatever she could find, roots dug from the frozen ground with bleeding fingers, bark stripped from birch and pine trees that she boiled into bitter but nutritious tea, the occasional rabbit she managed to trap using techniques she had read about but never practiced. The traps failed more often than they worked. The roots were often too tough to eat. The cold seeped into her bones despite every layer of insulation. There were nights when she lay shivering in the dark, too weak to move, too cold to sleep, certain she would not see the morning. She would recite poetry to keep her mind active. Poems her mother had taught her, verses from Shakespeare she had memorized from a tattered book. Anything to prove to herself that she was still alive, still thinking, still human. The lowest point came in January, during a cold snap that sent temperatures plunging to 20 below zero. Her fire went out during the night when she ran out of dry wood, and she woke in pre-dawn darkness, unable to feel her hands or feet. She could not get up. She could not summon strength to rebuild the fire. She lay in darkness and felt death settling over her like a blanket, cold, but almost comforting. She thought about her parents. She thought about how easy it would be to simply close her eyes and let go. No more hunger. No more cold. No more struggling against a world that had never wanted her. But then she thought about Mrs. Harrington, about the smug satisfaction in her voice as she accused Eliza of theft. She thought about Aunt Margaret, who had probably already forgotten she existed. She thought about everyone in Millbrook who had looked at her and seen nothing worth saving. Something in her refused to give them the satisfaction of being right. She forced herself to move. Inch by inch, she crawled toward the entrance where she had stored her driest kindling. Her hands were like blocks of wood, but she made them work. She struck her flint against steel again and again, dozens of times, hundreds, until finally a spark caught and grew into flame. She survived that winter by force of will alone. When spring came, Eliza emerged from her underground home like a creature reborn. She had lost 20 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, and her face in the reflection of a stream was gaunt and hollow-eyed. Her hands were scarred from frostbite, but her mind burned with plans. She would never be that helpless again. She spent that spring and summer preparing with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Working from before dawn until after dark, she cleared the land around the abandoned farm. She used the rusted knife to cut saplings, fashioning them into tools: a crude shovel, a rake, a hoe. She repaired the underground chambers, reinforcing walls with additional stone, improving drainage by digging channels, expanding the ventilation system with shafts that could be opened or closed to regulate temperature and airflow. She scavenged tools from the ruins of other abandoned properties. There were many in those Depression years. Families had fled farms that could no longer support them, leaving behind implements they couldn't carry. Eliza walked miles to find these forgotten places, returning with treasures: a real shovel with a cracked handle she could repair, a pickaxe, seeds from abandoned gardens. But her most important work was the potatoes. Eliza had read about potato cultivation in Ireland, how the humble tuber had sustained millions before the blight, how properly stored potatoes could last through the harshest winters and provide calories necessary for survival. She had read about different varieties, some bred for flavor, some for storage, some for disease resistance. She knew the precise conditions required: temperature between 35 and 40 degrees, high humidity, complete darkness, good air circulation. She begged, borrowed, and traded labor for seed potatoes from farms on the outskirts of other towns, places where no one knew her. She worked a full day's labor for a peck of seed potatoes. She traded possessions she had gathered for different varieties. She gathered local strains that had adapted to the harsh Pennsylvania climate over generations, and she planted. She planted potatoes in every cleared patch of ground. She planted them in terraces carved into the hillside, following techniques from agricultural pamphlets. She planted them in raised beds constructed from fallen logs. She kept detailed records, scratching notes onto bark with charcoal: which varieties, when planted, how deep, what amendments added. She was conducting agricultural experiments without knowing it. That fall, she harvested over 2,000 pounds of potatoes. The townspeople who occasionally passed by, hunters, travelers, laughed when they saw what she was doing. A young girl, alone, growing potatoes on abandoned land? "Those will rot before Christmas," one hunter told her with a knowing smirk. "You can't just bury food in the ground and expect it to keep." "The cold will get them," another said. "Or the moisture, or the rats. You're wasting your time, girl." Eliza said nothing. She had learned there was no point arguing with people who had already decided what they believed. She had modified the chambers based on everything she had read. She understood that the key was maintaining temperature just above freezing with high humidity, but good air circulation to prevent mold. She built wooden racks that kept potatoes off the floor, allowing air to flow around them. She separated her harvest by condition. The most perfect potatoes went deepest in storage. Those with minor damage were set aside to eat first. She layered them in straw and sawdust, which absorbed moisture and prevented rot spread. She checked weekly, removing any that showed spoilage. By first snow, she had over 2,000 pounds of potatoes safely stored, along with turnips, carrots, beets, cabbages she had made into sauerkraut, dried herbs, and smoked fish from the stream. It was during this second year that she met Henry Alderton. He was 73, a former farmer who had lost his land to the bank in 1931 and now lived in a small cabin several miles away. His wife had died the year before. His children had scattered to cities, and he had resigned himself to spending final years alone. He had heard rumors about the strange girl living alone in the mountains and came to see for himself. He expected to find a half-feral creature. What he found astonished him. He found terraced gardens laid out with geometric precision. He found a root cellar system that rivaled anything his grandfather had built in Ireland. He found a young woman who met his eyes without flinching and asked intelligent questions about crop rotation and soil composition. "You did all this yourself?" he asked, walking through the chambers with wonder. "The drainage, the ventilation, the racks?" Eliza nodded, uncertain whether he had come to help or judge her. "My father used to talk about root cellars in the old country," Henry said slowly. "He said a proper root cellar was like gold, worth more than money because you couldn't eat money in winter." He looked at her with new eyes. "You've built something special here, girl. Don't let anyone tell you different." Henry became her teacher and friend. He taught her things books couldn't: how to read the sky for coming weather, how to save seeds so they would germinate year after year, how to identify which wild plants were edible and which would kill you. He taught her to sharpen tools and repair handles, to build fences that kept out deer, to read soil by its color and texture. He taught the 1,000 small skills that made the difference between a farmer who thrived and one who merely survived. In return, she shared what she had learned from reading, and together they improved the storage system beyond anything either could have created alone. Henry knew practical techniques passed down through generations. Eliza knew scientific principles. When they combined knowledge, they created something new. Henry also taught her something more important, that she didn't have to be alone. "There are people suffering," he told her one evening as they shared a meal of stored potatoes and wild herbs. "Good people who can't find work, can't feed their children. If you build something big enough, you could help them. Not charity, that breaks a person's spirit, but honest trade, work for food, community." Eliza had spent so long thinking only of survival that helping others seemed foreign. But she realized Henry was right. Survival alone wasn't enough. What was the point of enduring if you had no purpose beyond endurance? She expanded her operation. The third summer, she cleared more land and planted not just potatoes but wheat, corn, and beans. She established an orchard of apple and pear trees that would take years to bear, but would eventually provide food for generations. She built a proper cabin above ground, though she still used underground chambers for storage. And she began trading. Word spread through the remote mountain communities that there was a young woman at the old Brennan place who would trade food for labor. At first, only the most desperate came. Families with nothing to lose, men who hadn't worked in months and were willing to do anything to feed their children. Eliza put them to work. She organized teams to clear more land, to build more storage chambers, to construct a network of root cellars extending far beyond her original discovery. She paid them in food, not just potatoes, but a balanced selection of vegetables and grains that would sustain a family. The payment was always fair, always consistent. More importantly, she taught them. "Don't just work for me," she told them. gathering workers in the evenings after the day's labor. Learn what I know. Take it back to your own land. Build your own storage. Grow your own food. This isn't magic. It's knowledge. And knowledge is meant to be shared. She explained root cellar construction, choosing sites with proper drainage, calculating depth below the frost line, creating ventilation to prevent mold. She explained the science of potato storage, the chemistry of fermentation, the art of seed saving. Some workers were skeptical at first. What could a young woman teach them? But when they saw results, when they returned home with full bellies and new skills, skepticism turned to respect. By the third year's end, Eliza had become something unexpected, a leader. People came not just for food, but for advice. Farmers from distant hollows made journeys to ask about planting schedules or pest control. Mothers brought children, hoping some knowledge would rub off. They called her the Potato Girl at first, then Miss Eliza, and finally, simply, Teacher. The underground network now held over 10,000 pounds of food, enough to feed dozens of families through a normal winter. But the winter of 1937 to 1938 was anything but normal. It began in late November with a blizzard that dropped 4 feet of snow in 2 days. Old-timers said they had never seen anything like it. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Wind piled it into drifts that buried barns. Then came the cold. Temperatures plunged below zero in December's first week and stayed there week after week. The mercury dropped to 20 below, then 30. Water froze in wells. Livestock froze in barns. People froze in their own homes when they ran out of fuel. Roads became impassable. The railroad connecting Millbrook to the outside world was buried under drifts 20 feet high. The trains couldn't get through. The trucks couldn't get through. Nothing could get through. And then Millbrook began to starve. The same people who had called Eliza a thief now found themselves trapped. The general store ran out of food within 2 weeks. The wealthy hoarded what they had, posting guards at their doors. The poor began to die. First the elderly went, people whose bodies couldn't handle cold and hunger together. Then the very young, babies and toddlers who needed more than their mothers could provide. Then the sick, the weak, the unlucky. It was desperate farmers who finally made the 3-day journey through the snow to the old Brennan place. They came to beg. Eliza recognized some of them. She recognized the man who had driven the wagon that took her away. She recognized the woman who had called her that strange girl and pulled her children away as if poverty were contagious. She could have turned them away. She had every right. They had cast her out, branded her a thief, left her to die. No one would have blamed her. But Eliza Crane had not spent 4 years building something just to prove she could be as cruel as the world had been to her. "How many are hungry?" she asked. 300 people, maybe more," said McAllister, the group's leader. "We've lost 12 already, mostly old folks and little children. We'll lose more unless something changes." Eliza thought about her supplies. 10,000 pounds of food sounded enormous, but divided among 300 people over months, it would stretch thin. Everything she had built would be consumed, but there would be people alive to see spring. "You can come," she said finally. "Not to take, to share. Everyone works, everyone eats. We'll portion it fairly, and I'll teach your people how to store food so this never happens again." The next 3 months were the hardest of her life, harder even than that first winter alone. She organized distribution with military precision, calculating exactly how many calories each person needed based on age, size, and work contribution. She established rationing that was absolutely fair, no special treatment for the wealthy, no discrimination against those who had wronged her. She put able-bodied workers to expanding storage facilities, cutting firewood, maintaining roads between shelter points. She organized women to cook communal meals that stretched every ingredient. She taught children lessons in agriculture that would serve them their whole lives. Henry Alderton, now 80 and failing, watched from his bed in Eliza's cabin as she transformed chaos into order. "I always knew you were special," he told her near the end, his voice barely a whisper. "But I didn't know how special until now." He died in February, peacefully, with Eliza holding his hand. She buried him when ground finally thawed, overlooking the terraced fields he had helped build. The headstone read, "Henry Alderton, teacher, friend, the first one who believed." Mrs. Harrington came to Eliza in March. The wealthy widow had lost 15 pounds and most of her arrogance. She stood in Eliza's cabin, unable to meet her eyes, and spoke words that must have tasted like ash. "I found the brooch," she said, "years ago, behind the settee, where it had fallen. I knew you didn't take it. I said nothing." The cabin was silent except for crackling fire. "I was afraid," Mrs. Harrington continued, voice breaking. "Afraid of admitting I was wrong. I let them drive you out because my pride mattered more than your life." Eliza studied the woman who had destroyed her old life. Mrs. Harrington looked ancient now, hollowed by guilt and hunger. There was nothing left to hate. "The food you've eaten this winter," Eliza said quietly. "You ate it with everyone else. I didn't treat you differently. I don't understand why. Because doing to you what you did to me would make me just like you were. I didn't survive all this to become that person." She turned to face Mrs. Harrington directly. "Go home. Tell people the truth if you want, or don't. It doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change what I've built. But don't ask for forgiveness. I'm not the one you need to forgive. That's your own work." 3 days later, Mrs. Harrington stood before the surviving townspeople and confessed everything: the false accusation, the years of knowing the truth, the cowardice. Eliza did not attend. She was busy planting the first seeds of spring. The winter of 1937 to 1938 became legendary in that part of Pennsylvania. People called it the Winter of Starvation and told stories about how an abandoned girl had saved 300 lives with potatoes stored in underground chambers carved from the mountain. But for Eliza, it was just the beginning. She spent the next decades expanding what she had built. The underground network grew to 12 separate chambers, holding over 50,000 pounds of food. She established the Brennan Farm Agricultural Collective, a cooperative where families could learn sustainable farming and contribute to a shared food reserve protecting against future disasters. She wrote pamphlets on root cellar construction and food preservation distributed throughout the region and eventually the country. She testified before state agricultural boards about community food storage. She trained hundreds in techniques later used during World War II rationing. In 1942, she married Thomas Weller, a quiet man who had been one of the first workers to come during the Depression. Together they raised 4 children, each of whom learned to farm and preserve food before they learned to read. Eliza Crane Weller died in 1992 at 74, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a community that had grown from seeds she planted during the darkest years. The underground chambers she discovered and expanded still existed, still functional, still used as models for sustainable food storage by agricultural programs worldwide. At her funeral, her eldest daughter read from a letter Eliza had written years before. "They called me a thief when I had stolen nothing. They called me strange when I was only curious. They called me foolish when I was preparing for what they refused to see coming. But I learned something important in those years alone. What other people call you has no power over who you actually are. You decide that yourself, through your actions, through what you build, through the life you create from whatever materials you're given. I was given abandonment and accusation. I built a community and a legacy. That arithmetic is available to anyone willing to do the work. Her grave marker stands on a hill overlooking the farm she created from nothing. Eliza Crane Weller, 1918 to 1992. She fed the hungry and taught them to feed themselves. The storage chambers are still in use today, maintained by a trust in her name. Every year, agricultural students come to study her techniques. Every year, the community holds a festival in her honor. And every year, someone new learns the lesson she spent her life teaching, that the very things that make you different, the curiosity, the questions, the refusal to accept what everyone else accepts, might be exactly what the world needs. That being cast out can be the beginning, not the end. That dirt and potatoes and determination can be transformed into something that outlasts you. What qualities do you have that others have dismissed or criticized? What dreams have you been told to abandon because they're impractical or strange or above your station? What could you build if you stopped listening to people who have already decided what's possible? Eliza Crane was a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a dress on her back and ideas everyone said were worthless. She died wealthy in the ways that matter, surrounded by love, having fed thousands, having created something that would continue growing long after she was gone. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about what you might be capable of building, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things against impossible odds. And remember what Eliza taught us: the world will tell you who you are. You get to decide whether to believe them. The potatoes they said would rot fed 300 people through the deadliest winter in living memory. The strange girl they threw away built something eternal. The verdict of the crowd was wrong, and the truth planted in the earth outlasted every lie told above it.